it's Margot, and today I'm talking about disappointments rooms, a dark and shameful bit of history that may not actually be just a deplorable thing of the past. If you're ready to dig up some carefully guarded family secrets, keep watching. Disappointments rooms were small spaces generally located at the top floor of a house, sometimes in the basement, where family members, usually children, suffering from mental and physical disabilities were kept, so they'd remain out of the public eye. Though this specific term seems local to North America, and perhaps even more specific to New England's upper class of yesteryear, this type of room has existed in homes all over the world for centuries. Before we get too far into this, I should mention that I'm a person with disabilities. I've talked about my health and mobility struggles a little bit on this channel. They're actually how and why this channel began, and why I'm doing the type of content I'm currently doing. I've always been interested in learning more about how disabled and chronically ill people have been treated and what they've accomplished throughout history, so don't be surprised if this sort of topic is a recurring theme here. I never speak for all people with disabilities. Even those with my exact diagnoses are vastly ranging in ability, and every one of us is a very unique individual with individual needs, talents, interests, and opinions. I also understand how difficult caregiving can be, and I want to preface this video by saying that the struggles and frustrations of caregivers are also valid. Nobody handles everything perfectly all of the time. In the old days, classism, ableism, and a severe lack of resources seemingly played the biggest parts in determining the fate of disabled family members. One would hope that in general, when we know better, we do better. But as you're about to hear, not everybody is a good human. Not everybody makes decent, compassionate choices or treats others with the basic dignity and respect that they deserve. If you're sensitive to hearing about abuse and neglect, you may want to skip this one. I won't be going into explicit detail, but those topics will be mentioned in the examples you're about to hear. We'll start with a little bit about the attitudes of the Regency era, though I'm sure family members who'd been perceived as undesirable had been tucked away out of sight far prior to that time period. What's known as the Regency era from 1811 to 1820 was the period of time that King George IV ruled as regent during the perceived madness of his father King George III until George III's death, when George IV officially took over the throne. When we think of this era today, most of us probably conjure images from popular culture, like Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice and the popular Netflix series Bridgerton. During this period of time, middle and upper-class children were often sort of locked away and barely seen. They were basically considered a worthless burden until they were old enough to speak rationally. Other trendy philosophies of the time included the thought that children were vessels of original sin who needed to be cleansed. Either way, they weren't the most desirable company for fashionable adults of the era. Upper-class parenting was outsourced to nannies. Otherwise, children were sent away to boarding schools or locked in an attic or spare room until they were deemed sufficiently logical and worthy of attention. It was a time of great vanity, at least for the wealthy, and those deemed undesirable didn't match the aesthetic. So you can imagine how many family members with disabilities in elite society were segregated for their entire lives, some kept entirely secret from those outside of the immediate family. The social elite often felt having a disabled family member reflected poorly on a family, so they carefully hid what they considered shameful. This carried over into Victorian times and beyond. It became common to lock people with special needs away in institutions or hide them in their family home. The justification for this practice was that it was for their own good and the good of society. This was seemingly rarely done with the special needs individual's quality of life or dignity in mind. You may have seen the 2016 paranormal horror movie titled The Disappointments Room, starring Kate Beckinsale. A description of the movie reads, Dana, her husband David, and their 5-year-old son Lucas start a new life after moving from the hustle and bustle of Brooklyn, New York to a stately old manor in the quiet countryside. After settling in, Dana starts to experience terrifying visions and dreams that she cannot explain. The mystery grows when she stumbles upon a secret room in the attic. After finding the key and unlocking the door, Dana discovers the dark history of the family that lived there in the 19th century. The movie was filmed at the stately Adamsley Mansion in Greensboro, North Carolina, and I thought it was pretty good. What you may not know is that this movie was loosely based on the real-life story of a Rhode Island librarian named Laurie Dumas. The real house was very different, and to my knowledge isn't haunted, but it does have a very haunting past of its own. When Laurie bought her colonial-style home, which was built in 1857, she was surprised to find a small room at the back of her attic. The front wall of the room actually sort of resembled the facade of a dollhouse. What stood out to Laurie as strange, though, was that there was a doorknob along with a deadbolt on only the outside, making it impossible for anyone inside the room to escape. There were 2 windows on the far wall of the room that were too high for anyone to safely climb out of. A feature perhaps even more peculiar was the floor, which was made of metal and had a drain built in. This was only discovered when Laurie found a white rag on the floor and began to pull it, finding the drain hidden underneath. When Laurie told her co-workers at the library about the strange room, a patron overheard and told her that what she has is known as a disappointments room. The patron explained that, to quote Laurie, historically these rooms were used for parents who had a child with a disability and they wanted to keep them a secret from the rest of the world, so they hid them away in a room up on the 3rd floor. After some research, Laurie discovered that her home had been owned by a prominent judge in the late 1800s. Cemetery records showed that the judge and his wife had a daughter named Ruth, who died at the age of 5. Though the judge and the rest of his family were prominently featured in local newspapers of the time, there was no mention to be found of little Ruth's birth or life, and only a very short mention of her death. Assuming young Ruth had been the former inhabitant of the strange little room in her attic, Laurie and her husband have decorated it in, as she said, colors a pretty little girl would appreciate, adding drapes, chairs, a table, and some dolls, in memory of the little girl who may have spent the entirety of her brief life in that room. Disappointments rooms have turned up in some classic literature, such as Charlotte Bronte's 1847 novel Jane Eyre, and the mad woman, or sometimes mad man, in the attic seems to have become a not uncommon trope from that point forward. In the much more modern Harry Potter series, the character of Dumbledore even had a sister who was kept hidden away. There are even some well-known historical figures who are known to have relatives tucked away from the public eye and largely forgotten. In around 1771, Sarah, the wife of Patrick Henry of Give Me Liberty or Give Me Death fame, had become increasingly mentally ill. The public hospitals of the time were no more than often windowless brick cells, where patients were basically warehoused until they died, often chained to a wall in leg irons. Tragic structures made up of nothing but disappointments rooms. Unable to bear the thought of sending Sarah to such a place, but bowing to social pressures of the time, Mr. Henry decided to seclude his wife in a 2-room section of their basement until her eventual death. There she had a fireplace, a bed, and even windows, but certainly no liberty to speak of. Acclaimed author of classic literature Jane Austen had a brother nearly 10 years her senior named George, with unspecified disabilities, who was rarely seen or known about by the public. No images exist of him. While it's said that the Austen family did take good care of George and an uncle who was also somehow impaired, it's thought that he did live a rather isolated life. They also made sure he was taken care of into his old age and until his eventual death. Though George clearly had it better than a lot of disabled people of his time, he's known now as Jane Austen's invisible brother because of the complete lack of information on his existence. The prominent Kennedy family, basically America's political dynasty, had their eldest daughter named Rosemary, a sister of President John F. Kennedy, who they pretty much kept in a fancy disappointments room. Rosemary was only 23 years old when she was institutionalized and lobotomized for behaviors that seemed to have stemmed from some brain damage, possibly caused by a nurse depriving her of oxygen by holding her in the womb at birth while waiting for the obstetrician to arrive. After her lobotomy, Rosemary was reportedly reduced to the mental capacity of a toddler and unable to speak or walk properly. She spent the next 20 years institutionalized and out of touch with her family. After reuniting with her family, Rosemary spent the remainder of her life in a private home called the Kennedy Cottage, which was staffed by 2 nuns off the campus of a Wisconsin mental institution, seemingly out of sight and out of mind from the rest of the Kennedys. But Rosemary wasn't completely forgotten. It seemed to be at least partially due to Rosemary's struggles that her younger sister Eunice Kennedy Shriver started a summer day camp in her own backyard in 1962 that evolved into the Special Olympics, now a global competition that involves 1.4 million athletes from 150 countries. Rosemary also seemingly inspired her brother, President John F. Kennedy, to initiate sweeping legislation designed to improve the quality of life for Americans with disabilities, the precursor to the Americans with Disabilities Act. And she inspired her sister, Jean Kennedy Smith, to start the Very Special Arts Program, and her nephew, Anthony Shriver, to start the Best Buddies program. Hospitals, schools, and other facilities around the world have been named in Rosemary Kennedy's honor. Her legacy lives on, and improvements have been made in her name, but it's important to remember that Rosemary and others didn't need to suffer simply for being different. Every human being is different. Different doesn't mean defective, and it doesn't necessarily mean we need to be fixed. It certainly never means we should be thrown away. The practice of keeping disabled children and adults hidden away still exists in various regions of the world today. In places where this is common cultural practice, there tends to be a high mortality rate for children with disabilities who are hidden and mistreated, often from birth. After being kept indoors for years, hidden children have been found emaciated, with altered skin and hair color from the lack of exposure to sunlight. But this isn't just happening in remote parts of the world, out of sight and out of mind. It's happening right under all of our noses, in big cities, small towns, and suburbs, possibly even near you. It doesn't take a lot of digging to find plenty of examples from recent years of disabled people being held in homes against their will, right here in the U.S. Nowadays, the reasons behind it are usually a bit different, though. I can understand not wanting to send a family member to an institution and being ill-equipped to handle their needs on your own, or needing to occasionally and temporarily segregate somebody for their own safety and the safety of others. I understand that while resources for struggling families and individuals are far better than they used to be, they're still not always readily available. There are no easy answers for those issues, certainly none that I have for you today. The stories I'm about to tell you aren't about caregivers who are doing their best in a tough situation but are in over their heads. They're not even about people who are ashamed to have a family member with disabilities. They're about people who, one way or another, found people with disabilities to take advantage of, imprison, and strip of their basic human rights, dignity, and more often than not, their disability benefits. These people are the lowest of the low, in my opinion, and these present-day disappointments rooms are the stuff of nightmares. Back in 2011, 4 mentally disabled people were found locked in a basement in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, when the building's landlord came upon a pair of suspicious dog bowls under a basement workbench in the No Pets Allowed building. Upon inspection, he found 3 malnourished men and 1 woman, aged 29 to 41, in a 10-foot by 15-foot sub-basement boiler room that police have referred to as a dungeon. 1 man was found chained to a radiator in the room. The room contained an old mattress and flat boards with dirty pillows and bedding, a single bucket for the group to use as a toilet. The ceiling of the room wasn't high enough for an adult to stand upright. The landlord freed the chained man and called the police. 4 people were charged with kidnapping, aggravated assault, false imprisonment, and other related offenses for imprisoning the 4 victims so they could collect their disability benefits. The alleged ringleader, a woman named Linda Weston, was in possession of up to 50 ID records, including power of attorney paperwork and social security numbers, when she was arrested. It's believed she'd victimized dozens of people across multiple states over the course of 11 years, and had previously served 8 years in prison for starving a 25-year-old man to death. Police in the state of Virginia also confirmed that they'd been investigating the 2008 death of a woman who'd been living with Weston. Weston had fled immediately after calling police to report the death. Upon these discoveries and the subsequent arrests, police also recovered the 19-year-old niece of Weston, who'd been missing for 2 years. She was found with open wounds, burn marks, scars, and broken bones that had been repeatedly fractured over time. She'd obviously been tortured. In another unanticipated twist, they then discovered a 15-year-old girl who'd also been held by the people who'd been arrested. She'd been missing from her home for about 3 months. 3 dogs were also removed from the home, which explained the suspicious basement dog bowls. In 2016, 7 malnourished special needs children ages 13 to 16 were found locked in a tiny bedroom in a home in an upscale subdivision in the Houston, Texas suburb of Richmond. The room reeked of urine and feces. One teen with Down syndrome was found wearing a dirty diaper. Authorities soon discovered that the teens had also spent hours on end crammed into a 5-foot by 8-foot closet where they were forced to soil themselves whenever the adults were away from the home. The children were punished with a paddle if they tried to escape. They all were found to have learning disabilities, and none of them had ever set foot in a school. A spokesperson for the Texas Department of Family and Protective Services told the Associated Press that they were really hidden, even from people in the same home. The teens' adoptive mother, Paula Sinclair, known to them as Mom, and a man named Alan Richardson, whom they referred to as Coach, were charged with aggravated kidnapping and injury to a child. 3 other men were also found living in the same basement in a purported group home operated by Paula Sinclair. Also, back in January 2011, a 7-year-old boy had reportedly died in the same home. It seems like this is a house that probably should have been on somebody's radar. This year, in January of 2022, a self-professed pastor named Curtis Keith Bankston and his wife Sophia Sim Bankston were arrested for keeping 8 physically and mentally disabled people, ages 25 to 65, locked in the basement of their home near Atlanta, Georgia. The couple were operating an unlicensed care facility in which they allegedly deadbolted the people in their care into a basement room against their will while completely controlling their finances and allegedly withholding medical care. This was discovered after paramedics responded to a report of a patient having a seizure on January 13, 2022. They notified police after spotting the deadbolt on the basement door. Authorities say this makeshift facility was being operated under the guise of a church. Both of the Bankstons were charged with false imprisonment, while their 8 victims were placed into suitable care and housing by Georgia's Division of Aging Services and Department of Human Services. In a statement, the Bankstons' lawyers claimed the facility was not a group home, but rather a Christian ministry that supplies room and board to individuals who have at oftentimes been homeless or wards of the state. Over the course of my research into this, I also read about a 22-year-old autistic Louisiana woman who was kept locked in a 6-foot by 8-foot cage behind a mobile home for months in 2016. In 2013, a blind 25-year-old woman was found locked in a cage in the back room of a home in Texas. There are so many stories like these out there that have made their way into the public eye, and I really could go on and on telling you about dozens more of these extreme cases. How many more are still hidden to this day in our own communities? Lori Dumas, the lady whose home was used as inspiration for Hollywood's The Disappointments Room, is working on spreading awareness about the plight of many disabled people throughout history and in today's society. She said, "This is how we grow from the mistakes of the past. This was at the turn of the 20th century, but even before that the rooms existed, and in some places they still exist now. It's sad. The whole thing is very upsetting. Most of these rooms are in houses that have been renovated, so we've lost history," she said. "I've just been trying to get as much research out as I can before other things are lost. This is the world's best kept secret." She went on to say, "My quest has been to give them the recognition and respect that was stolen from them, to give them a place in history, because as it stands they didn't exist. They had them, they hid them, and then they died." Lori has started a non-profit in the once-forgotten little girl named Ruthie's memory called Ruthie's Room. The organization holds fundraisers to provide portable sensory comfort items to athletes in the Special Olympics Summer Games and for disabled and special needs students in the local public schools in Lori's area. Sadly, it looks like the fundraisers have been put on hold for now due to lack of interest in donations. I'll post a link to the Ruthie's Room Facebook page in the description and comments of this video in case you want to send Lori and the organization some love and encouragement for what they're trying to do. I try not to turn my videos into personal rants, but some topics just resonate with me on a deeper level than others do. This is one of those topics. I wasn't that sickly as a child, though without modern medicine I probably would have been a good candidate for the Disappointments Room, and I certainly would be as an adult if I'd made it that far. It does need to be discussed that while greatly improved, our society and the systems in place still aren't really set up for disabled people to thrive. Many people still seem to believe that merely existing with minimal comforts and enjoyments should be enough for us, and ableist attitudes are still deeply ingrained in us all, even in people with disabilities. The common mindset is that nobody's ever doing enough, that absolutely necessary rest and self-care equal laziness, which is considered a negative trait, that we're only as valuable as what we can produce, that working ourselves to death is acceptable and even worthy of merit. I'm beyond guilty of telling myself these things probably every day, though I'm actively working on deprogramming myself from that bullshit mindset. I assure you, if there is any meaning to life, that isn't it. Quality of life needs to be prioritized for everyone. As Mahatma Gandhi said, the true measure of any society can be found in how it treats its most vulnerable members. Gandhi was plenty problematic in his own right, but on this we agree. If you have any reason to suspect someone is being abused or neglected, please report it to your local authorities. That's all I have for you today. I hope you've enjoyed hearing a bit about this topic and will come back for more. Like, subscribe, leave a comment, and bring your friends, family, COVID pod, cult members, invisible friends, or enemies. And if you have a subject you'd like for me to do a video about, leave it in the comments below. Thanks so much for watching.